privilege for me to introduce our speaker for this afternoon, Melbourne-based and internationally active polymathic musician, Mr. Paul Grabowsky. I trust I can portray a sense of Paul's broad and generous artistic vision, involvements and accomplishments within the few minutes that I've been allocated. Paul's been a constant, challenging companion of mine for well over a decade, although I've only met him a couple of times in person and then very briefly. I'm referring, of course, to the pleasures and provocations I've derived from listening to his music making, both live and on numerous recordings. So, who is Paul Grabowsky? Paul has served in vital arts leadership and administrative roles nationally, including his current position as Artistic Director of the Adelaide Festival, as well as a period in the mid-2000s as Artistic Director of the Queensland Music Festival and in the late 1990s as Commissioning Editor for ABC Television Arts and Entertainment. He was also a significant musical contributor to the Sydney Olympic Games ceremonies. Paul's a virtuoso pianist and composer. He's recorded well over 20 albums of original music with various trios and small and large ensembles. He's also composed numerous film scores and an opera. One of his hidden classics, a favourite of mine, is the piano trio album Love's Calendar, composed for the now extensive Hush series of recordings, which pioneered a new kind of music devised initially at least to transform environments for medical treatment into spaces of healing, comfort and recovery. I recall several years ago watching the memorable Paul Cox film Molokai about a 19th century Belgian priest's work in a leper colony in eastern Polynesia. Paul Grabowsky's score, through its sensitivity to mood, space, history and culture, imbued the film with considerable warmth and power. The score for his opera, composed in the early 2000s, titled Love in the Age of Therapy, was described by one reviewer as, quote, an eclectic musical patina that ranges from jazz to Latin tango to Bob Dylan to Puccini, and a rich orchestral flood that in places calls to mind Schoenberg's Pierrot Lunaire and the rich vocal lines of Richard Strauss, while revealing the composer as a fine writer of love songs. Paul's also a legendary ensemble founder and leader and a generous artistic collaborator. Not only has he worked with and released albums featuring international jazz icons of several eras over the past 30 years, his extensive list of collaborators and recorded collaborations also include leading Australian musical figures, from the trumpeter Scott Tinkler and singers the late Ruby Hunter and her partner Archie Roach, as well as Katie Noonan and Paul Kelly, to instrumentalists including the oboist Diana Doherty and the Goldner String Quartet. He founded the remarkable Australian Art Orchestra in the early 1990s, with whom he instigated a series of inspirational cross-disciplinary intercultural performance projects, including the multimedia theatre work Theft of Cedar, which is grounded in Balinese gamelan and shadow puppetry. And also the Australian Art Orchestra has performed the Carnatic or South Indian classical music and contemporary jazz fusion work Into the Fire, an improvisational reworking of J.S. Bach's St. Matthew's Passion, and recently Crossing Roper Bar, an ongoing collaboration with the Young Waggalak group of musicians and dancers of Arnhem Land in Northern Australia. As a nurturer of emerging talent down the years, he's musically mentored a long list of performers in addition to those he gigs with, including the pianist Aaron Chulai and the singer-composer Megan Washington. Paul's awards and honours include 3 ARIAs, an AFI award, a Helpman award, a Sidney Meyer Performing Artist of the Year award. In 2007, he was awarded the Melbourne Prize for Music worth $60,000. Not only does he think through music, but he's also a significant musical thinker, and one of, if not the, leading public arts intellectual in Australia. In a historically grounded public lecture he delivered at the Australian National University in 2010 titled The Complete Musician, Paul knowledgeably, systematically and boldly interrogated the politics and practices of music education in Australia. In today's lecture, he takes on the controversial politics of genre definitions, specifically of jazz, as that music continues its global spread. We look forward to finding out whether jazz is only the Black American Symphony, as trumpeter Nicholas Payton puts it, or whether it might also be a language of bar crossing, of reconciliation between Indigenous and non-Indigenous Australians, for example, or of other possible intercultural collaborations and communications. Ladies and gentlemen, let's welcome today's Alfred Hook lecturer, Mr. Paul Grabowsky.
Well, hi there. Thank you very much. I'm sure they were very nice words, Michael, but this place is so effectively soundproofed that, of course, I couldn't hear any of it. So it might be a thin tissue of lies and deceptions, but I'm very, very honoured to be here. And I'd like to acknowledge also that we are meeting On the traditional lands of the Gadigal clan of the Eora Nation, and I recognise those people, I recognise their ancestors for whom this land has represented their memories, their hopes and their dreams. Well, let's talk about jazz. The music known as jazz is now well into its second century. It has grown up, reached its maturity and left home. It lives in a riotously polygamous relationship with numerous partners and has produced various offspring. It still maintains strong attachments and affection for its ancestral homeland. But like all successful emigrants, it has carved out new lives, new relationships, and looks at new horizons wherever it finds itself. I want to talk about where jazz sits in our cultural politics, its relevance, and how and why we should understand it in the 21st century. The question of why we should understand jazz is an important one, because of the vast amount of ignorance that continues to surround the word, and to a degree continues to account for its comparatively marginalised place on the national stage. While I don't intend to dwell on issues of funding today, it is always useful to remind ourselves of why public money is dispersed the way it is. Our symphony orchestras, together with the National Opera Company and indeed classical music in general, still receive by far the highest proportion of taxpayers' money. Something like $70 million goes to the Western canon and its offshoots. Although I think you'll find that Australian compositions make up a tiny proportion of this money, and indeed that commissioning money for new works largely springs from the depleted coffers of the Australia Council Music Board, with the rest of musical activity fighting for the crumbs offered by state and federal agencies. This funding anachronism is rooted in notions of ethical and moral uplift that emerged with an increasingly affluent 19th century European middle class, which located the heroic aspirations of a nation within its civilised culture and its associated civilising mission, one of the major justifications underlying the imperial projects of Western powers. Thus, music became understood as an expression of the higher self of the citizen, and its consumption within grand and imposing buildings full of pictorial references to a noble past certainly did much to transport the work of a composer away from the creative struggle towards relocation to the priesthood in a secular temple. The conundrums inherent in such a monoculture reveal their ironies in Australia via ageing subscriber bases, orchestras forced into grotesque parodies of themselves as backing bands for ageing rockers with grandiose pretensions, and a fear of the new with regard to any real commitment to the mainstream programming of new music. Perhaps it is simply a fact that the orchestra no longer represents the ne plus ultra for today's composer. Because, unlike the giants of the Western canon, today's composers and its instrumentalists are fed through a bewildering array of inputs and are influenced in their thinking by a lot of music to which that canon has often only a tenuous connection. While the voice of the village musician, the transmitter of oral traditions, has been a growing force in formal music since the mid-19th century, and indeed can be said to be part of the action for centuries before that, with the emergence of jazz via the earliest recordings from 1917 on, the game really did change. The 20th century's métier was rhythm, fed into our musical discourse through the conduit of mass culture. In the 21st century, the internet has done more to supply us with information and direct experience of music than at any time in history. With the increasing tempo of information flow, the complexity, the layering, the referencing and the ironies have increased exponentially. Meanwhile, the questions around what the purpose, the aesthetic, the function, the aspiration of all this music might be remains an item for discussion, as it always has. None of this, by the way, is meant as a put-down to the orchestral musician. Any self-respecting musical culture needs the wherewithal to be able to represent its traditions to the highest possible level of excellence. My problem, rather, is with what I see as a deep-seated conservatism in our cultural politics, one that through lack of courage continues to locate the priorities of our music making within outdated notions of privilege. The emergence of jazz is one of those ironies of history in which something of enduring beauty emerges from a mountain of misery. An estimated 12 million slaves were shipped from Africa to the Americas between the late 16th and early or mid-19th centuries. Of these, nearly 645,000, we think, went to the United States. The many cultures which were carried through these enforced migrations emerged in various different ways and continue to as we speak. But jazz embodies, like nothing else, the massive energies unleashed by the conjunction of African American self-expression with the unparalleled dynamics of the American industrial economy and the emergence of the USA as the world's first modern multicultural nation. Jazz is viral. It is the result of a potent mix of urban and rural black musical forms with various European-inspired styles, played on both European and African-derived instruments. It arose in a particular milieu, in a place that allowed for a fluid exchange between various ethnic and socio-economic groupings. Its identity as the fashion accessory of an alluring demi-monde assured its attachment to any self-confident metropolis. As the song goes, everywhere it hung its hat was home, whether in Chicago, New York, St. Louis, Kansas City, or San Francisco. Wherever it went, it changed. The four square syncopations of ragtime gave way to the riotous counterpoint of New Orleans, the poetic melancholy of the white Chicagoans, the sonic explorations of the Cotton Club, the giants of swing, the protean energies of bebop, the day-glow storytelling of the Texans, and cool jazz from nerdy white boys and horn-rimmed glasses, college jazz in 5/4, and exquisitely blue ballads from Esquire magazine's Best Dressed Man for 1960, whose saxophone player was pushing the music towards the mystical, the transcendental. Those names, Louis Armstrong, Jelly Roll Morton, Bix Beiderbecke, Duke Ellington, Benny Goodman, Charlie Parker, Ornette Coleman, Lenny Tristano, Dave Brubeck, Miles Davis, John Coltrane. They are some of the titans of the jazz mythos. There are many others, each one notable for a directness of expression, an attachment to the perishable, the ephemeral, a desire to make music with the precision of a watchmaker etched in smoke. A combustible music which burned both in execution and development. Being the expression of imaginations with nothing to lose, and more often than not being a young person's game, many of its leading voices were dead by 40. It went through its viral metastases at the speed of sound, leading to a moment of crisis in 1970, when that best-dressed man, now swapping tailored suits for the most fantastic statements of Carnaby Street, lent on a backbeat for a black audience, hoping to return the music to its original owners. The decision of Miles Davis to play a music employing a mixture of jazz and non-jazz players in order to move the music onto a new plane really has been, in hindsight, one of the watershed moments in its history. In Miles Davis, we have a figure who summons up for many the attractions of the genre, the epitome of cool, his poise expressed through his unerring ear and creative courage. Miles was to jazz what Picasso was to painting, a superstar, whose very being was emblematic, and whose most iconic work is as much a perfect design statement as a work of art. The idea that the formal conventions, appearance, instrumentation, and attitude of the music had suddenly been led by its most high-profile and enigmatic figure into an entirely new paradigm came as a shock, and we still find an argument raging in some quarters about the nature and definition of jazz as a result. So should this small culture battle concern us here, far away from the wellsprings of the music? Have we enough of a stake in our own jazz traditions that these family feuds over a birthright should be of little interest to us? Australian jazz history is not quite into its second century, having really arrived courtesy of some West Coast US dancehall orchestras during the 1920s. As so often in our experience of the music, it is the idea of the word, rather than a direct experience of a jazz culture, that has informed our relationship to it. Recordings were hard to come by, and the arrival of original voices took a while to happen. Certainly by the late 30s, there were individuals emerging from the dance band scene who would later make a mark. But the transformative, self-fueling propulsion of a music which in itself embodied the dreams of a people seeking freedom was far away. The identification of the left with the rights of the dispossessed must have played a part in the thinking of the Bell Brothers, whose Australian jazz band created great excitement on a post-war tour of Czechoslovakia. But the word remained in the wider public imagination only as long as it was associated with the dance hall. Modern jazz, the domain of the self-conscious connoisseur, was meanwhile emerging in Melbourne, where Don Banks, working with early pioneers Eddie Oxley, Charlie Blott and Bruce Clark, made his first recordings during the late 40s. Indeed, it is true to say that the story of Australian jazz is largely, but not exclusively, a tale of two cities, in which both of them, Sydney and Melbourne, played a leading role at different times. The existing literature on the subject is not always across this important point. A quick glance at the entry on Australian jazz in Wikipedia will show that it is largely a Sydney-focused piece, evidence perhaps of the need for a new historical survey which casts a clear eye over what is a fascinating story. Without going into a detailed survey of that history, it is now possible to talk about the emergence of some key voices in Australian jazz who began to create their methods during the 1960s. People like Mike Knock, drummers John Pochet and Alan Turnbull, saxophonists Bernie McGann and Brian Brown, to name a handful. The music has always depended on suitable locations in which to experience it. And at various times during the mid to late 20th century, the Basement and El Rocco in Sydney, the Embers and the Commune in Melbourne have given some kind of employment to creative musicians and an opportunity for them to interact with their audiences, an essential part of the jazz experience. Indeed, the culture of jazz music requires at least one suitable venue in a city running music at least 5 nights a week. For part of the cultural or the countercultural attraction of jazz, particularly jazz from the bebop era on, is the possibility of experiencing the full power of a performance with its heady mix of intellect and passion within the narrow confines of a dimly lit den, these days no longer a repository for exhaled tobacco fumes, but certainly in its heyday, the quintessential urban chapel for a very secular communion. This closeness of performance is essential to understanding jazz. The idea that a performer's flights of fancy amount to a private sharing of arcane information, information surrounding us that the music attempts to unpack and give form to, or perhaps to celebrate the way we experience it as a continuous present, a teletyped message from the spheres channelled through a zoot-suited magus. Jazz, in its application of musical materials, a highly literate form, attracted thinkers, writers, fashionistas, fringe dwellers, and a community of players who, in their combination of instrumental virtuosity and spontaneous presentation of their art, combined the role of travelling player with that of modernist artist, with the studio being the jazz club. In Australia, jazz developed steadily, if within a fairly narrow cultural bandwidth. Its audiences tended to be insiders, passionate hobbyists, partisans. After all, it requires a real commitment from an audience member, particularly a non-musician, to commit to the listening experience. But then the same could be said of the situation surrounding classical music. The formal surrounds of a concert auditorium give us little choice but to focus on the performance. And here the stage presents a simulacrum of the passive relationship between audience and performer, or between audience, composer, and performer as mediator. A jazz club presents a sort of Brechtian paradigm, one in which there is a ritual being enacted between the expectations of the fan for the familiar expressed anew, or for the new expressed as the familiar, or even at times the unexpected expressed with compelling strangeness. Some jazz makes demands on its performers that can only be described as heroic, if by that we mean that in the act of improvising, the performer is stretching him or herself beyond what might at the time be achievable. An element of risk unique to the form. I mean this in the sense that, given a jazz solo's existence as an improvisation, there have not been the countless repetitions of particular passages to achieve perfect rendering, as you might prepare Liszt or Paganini, but rather a harnessing of a mass of musical information in order to be able to create recombinations at a moment's notice. This is what I like to call applied music. At the heart is the relationship between the player and the instrument, in which the trick and its secret are revealed simultaneously. The very process of music making being subject and object. To try and locate this musical methodology to a fixed set of coordinates is to miss the point, which is why jazz continues its process of morphing when and wherever it occurs. Which is why it should come as no surprise that jazz has proven to be a particularly suitable avenue for the Australian musical imagination. Jazz feeds off its environment. As a countercultural activity that enjoyed a brief period as the preferred popular music of its day, it often relies on an ironic relationship to the world to provide it with its material, but also as a kind of defence mechanism. The beboppers delighted in quotation of musical phrases from every conceivable source, from Mendelssohn's Wedding March to The Rite of Spring. This ability to pluck musical detritus out of the air and relocate it in the middle of an improvised discourse on an existing chord progression with which the quote has otherwise nothing to do, reminds me of the way that language is manipulated or applied in rap, or in the use of sampled material as a referent. Behind it all is the use of humour as a weapon, a reminder that the musical universe is not the domain of an exclusive group, but that in being able to roll out extravagant flights of fancy, complete with musical footnotes, a new paradigm is being set for the boundaries of virtuosity. The implications of this new relationship of an instrumentalist to the instrument, in which it becomes in every sense of the word an extension of or an addition to the voice, in which the musician is using the instrument to report to us from the front line, as it were, without the mediating influence of rumination before encoding it as a fixed entity, a composition. This vital release of a supercharged energy into the atmosphere has been a powerful new force in modern musical history, a force for change in the way we perceive what a musician can tell us. We now have a few generations of Australian jazz and improvising musicians who are able to look back on a homegrown legacy of music made here. Recording is the medium through which the improvisations of our players are documented, and it is far more available to artists to be able to produce their own works as sound files than at any previous point in history. Since the 80s, there has been a much more frequent traffic between the various relevant musical communities, and intercity collaborative projects are now common. In a nation of our size, with our peculiar demographic spread, this sense of there being a commonality of purpose has been a major shift in focus, together with the spread of jazz education into our tertiary institutions. Jazz education is, of course, heavily reliant on an agreed orthodoxy around what jazz means. There are accepted terms, theoretical structures, technical and ear training exercises, prescribed listening lists, repertoires of songs and tunes, all of which help to produce musicians who are at some moment in their lives, or who at some moment in their lives have sought to learn about music in a non-classical way. And an education needs a structure. The music, however, is already moving into areas of complexity that few, if any, jazz methods have covered. Now, we have converging lines of compositional developments in Western concert music, together with advances in approach which have led the ever-restless jazz-thinking improvisers towards concepts found in very diverse sources, for example, the Carnatic tradition of South India, or the music of American composer Elliott Carter, to name but two. I mentioned earlier that the métier of 20th century music was rhythm. Well, so far into its second decade, that has continued to be true of the 21st century, but with various twists. Rhythm is removing itself from constant tempo and the subtle pulse relationships that generate swing into a far more complex world of metrical modulation, constant tempo change and variation. Harmony has long dissociated itself from reliance on the hoary old circle of fifths to a world of all-interval chords and motivic or cellular development and polymodality and abstraction. The technical demands on the players and vocalists, who increasingly are expected to be able to vocalise on an equal footing with the instruments, are on a par with the expectations placed on interpreters of recent notated music, requiring control of extended techniques, extremes of range and tone colour. In fact, there is an intersection occurring across improvised music and new composition in which the interests of players and composers have fed into each other's practice. This is perhaps not a world away from the desire of third-stream composers in the 1950s to create a new classical music based around jazz improvisations, set within sophisticated composed environments. New technologies, particularly real-time effects processing and interactive software, are pushing the improvisational paradigm into areas which hark back to the collective roots of jazz music, but which exist in a different sonic universe. The bottom line is that jazz, having long since arrived, is still waiting with increasing impatience to be picked up from the railway station. But we must first get clear about how we are prepared to embrace the term in order to deliver it from the tired value judgments coming not only from the guardians of privilege, but equally from an old guard of jazz or their adherents who are still convinced that swing and the blues are ingredients without which the word jazz cannot be applied. We learn in a conversation published in The Australian on March the 21st with Opera Australia director and a friend of mine, Lyndon Terracini, that the idea of there being a university degree in jazz is mad, because jazz is from the street, and that anyone should just ask Paul Grabowsky. Well, he's wrong. The street from which jazz may once have come is now a grid of numerous global pathways, and the idea that it is defined by, and therefore located within, its marginalised origins is a ghettoising argument, no longer of either interest or value, particularly to the many young musicians who continue to move the music forward. On the other side of the equation, we have the jazz neocons, whose arch-ideologues are the writers Stanley Crouch and Albert Murray. Their most vocal and high-profile spokesperson in recent years has been trumpeter and composer Wynton Marsalis, who, it must be said, has done much to elevate the word jazz to quasi-canonical status in the world of American culture. His is a finite jazz, proud of its heritage as the great creation of post-slavery black America. But his insistence on its linkage to blues and swing lock it, and particularly in some of his own compositions, into a strangely self-conscious world of the virtual, the disembodied, even, dare I say it, the inauthentic. Nicholas Payton, a trumpeter and vocalist born in New Orleans in 1973, has some very strong views on jazz and racism. In his blogs on these matters, he insists on the linkages between these two things, revealing a radicalised viewpoint from an artist whose music tends to the conservative. Here are some lines from a recent blog entry titled, "On This Whole Death of Jazz Thing." Everybody's making a lot of noise about this whole death of jazz thing. How are we mourning something that's been gone a long time ago and highly questionable if it even really existed? The question to me is not if jazz is dead or will die, but rather if it was ever alive. Okay, let's say jazz is alive. Then it has most certainly been on life support for quite some time. Personally, I think somebody should sneak in the room and euthanise it. Maybe if jazz dies, cats will start playing the blues again. You don't have to play blues if you play jazz. Shit, you don't even have to swing. So I say, let it die. The original Dixieland jazz band made the first jazz record. Paul Whiteman was the king of jazz. Louis Armstrong played the blues. Miles Davis played the blues. If it was good enough for them, it's good enough for me. You can play anything and call it jazz, but you can only do one thing when you're playing the blues. You can get a jazz master's degree in countless schools across the globe. There's only one way to master the blues. You can teach somebody how to play jazz. You can't teach anybody how to play the blues. You can only give it to them. The premier jazz venue in the world rests on prime realty in Manhattan. I think it's safe to say that jazz has officially crossed over. Ever notice that no one ever speaks of the blues dying? Why? As long as there's life, there will be blues. Words of Nicholas Payton. Thus, it is possible to see jazz as the conceptual battleground in a racial political war in its homeland. An understandable situation, given the history of racial politics in the US, and illustrative of the ongoing difficulties for the J word in its 21st century journey. Perhaps it is more useful for us to speak of a post-jazz time, one in which the established traditions and currents, the unmistakable sounds of what we know to be jazz music, are now part of a cultural memory that is drawn on, reconfigured, and blended with other newer elements in the ongoing genetic splicing that represents the essential nature of this music. For me, jazz has been an application of musical knowledge, a way of doing things, an adverb rather than a noun. What is very clear, whatever you want to call it, is that this music, this phenomenon, which in its history represents a reversal of fortune by the descendants of the African diaspora, and which, through its revitalised sense of the musician being in charge of the totality of the process, has turned musical practice on its head. It has brought a new urgency to the table around how we make music, and therefore what the needs of the future musician will be. That this then leads logically to a re-examination of what the future of currently preferred areas such as orchestral music will be, what kind of environment we will be creating, what kind of investment we should be making in these areas, and how therefore public money is to be dispersed is axiomatic. That so much money is invested in a culture with its head firmly in the sand, while so much vitally important music making is held in a situation of penurious peril simply because of an ongoing idea that the correct place of something called jazz, a 20th century term, is something called the street, is old thinking. The education of jazz musicians, with its insistence on understanding music as an experiential medium rather than something totally dedicated to interpretation, has brought the act of playing music into a fresh relationship with the art of living. Of course, music itself is imperilled in some cases by a tertiary system which has decided that the needs of the music student are of lesser importance and economically unsustainable in an environment driven towards the nether regions by the bottom line. That we are a great nation of musicians, whether we talk of the custodians of the traditional songs of our First Nations, the oldest performative traditions on the planet, the fine musicians in our best classical ensembles, our infinitely creative rock and pop and country musicians, or the diverse and astonishing creative spirits among our improvisers who continue to deeply impress our international peers. That this is one of our strongest suits is beyond doubt. That the cultural politics underlying the spending of money on our nation's musicians represents a clinging on to models from our colonial past is also beyond reasonable doubt. Our realisation of jazz within our own cultural framework has led to a considerable musical literature, growing international awareness and interest, and lively exchanges of opinion around its meaning and significance. As Australians, a nation improvised against the odds, we have generally had to think on our feet, and thus the idea of the musician who makes things up should be central to our narrative and applauded by our lawmakers. Our audiences are growing, and the success of the current crop of festivals is evidence of the continuing and growing support of this exciting music by people, many of who are attending jazz events for the first time. According to US trade journal Billboard, sales of recorded music under the category jazz were up 26% in 2011. It is symptomatic of our vagueness about the J word that Kenny G and Michael Bublé can both be found there. But then where would classical sales, up 10%, be without the Classic 100 and André Rieu? Those who seek the music will find the music. Its growing influence is now an irreversible force. Whether jazz or post-jazz, Noun or adverb, it's in us and it's around us. We will continue to make of it what we will, just as players of the music have done in Europe, in South Africa and Japan. It has become a way of understanding the world, a working model of multiculturalism, an expression of tolerance, a global translator, a pluralistic philosophy in which the moment of creation is a moral transmitter. I'll finish with a quote from Isaiah Berlin, great philosopher. He said, "Happy are those who live under a discipline which they accept without question, who freely obey the orders of leaders, spiritual or temporal, whose word is fully accepted as unbreakable law, or those who have, by their own methods, arrived at clear and unshakable convictions about what to do and what to be that brook no possible doubt. I can only say that those who rest on such comfortable beds of dogma are victims of forms of self-induced myopia, blinkers that may make for contentment, but not for understanding of what it is to be human." There is a piano here. I thought I would play a short piece. Thank you. Because as they say, talk is cheap. Can he play? Well, we'll see. I thought I might play a piece I wrote many years ago, actually, but something that I still enjoy playing, because as an improvising musician, it's different every time. This is called The Happy-Go-Lucky Country. And I better take the scarf out of the piano. Otherwise it'll be Sonatas and Interludes by John Cage.